Hello everybody, it's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome here Professor Bernd Herzogenrath from Goethe University of Frankfurt am Main. I don't think it's necessary to introduce him because all of you or most of you are familiar with his work, yes, or you know him personally, but let me just recollect a few of his most important publications. Bernd is author of An Art of Desire, reading Paul Auster, An American Body Politics, A Deleuzian Approach, and also editor of The Farthest Place, the music of John Luther Adams, and also Deleuze and Guattari and Ecology. His latest publications include the collections The Film of Bill Morrison, Aesthetics of the Archive, and Film as Philosophy. I would also like to mention the edited volume, Practical Aesthetics, to which some of you even contributed. So if you want to check, you can have a look. And now I pass word to Bernd. Stage is yours, and I'm looking forward to your talk.
Wait. Which don't say anything before you. Okay.
Will be about academic writing, anarchist affects, and the main focus is Spinoza, Deleuze, and anarchistic theory. And I think it's a very important lesson for all of us, because we all need to learn how to write better essays, how to improve our academic writing, to make it more fun and more productive, thought-provoking, and this is what we will all learn from Bernd. So I'm very much looking forward to his talk.
It's not about that. Thank you, Peter, for your invitation, and thanks for the crowd. Before I start, there's a promise I have to fulfill, which goes like that. This is for Ivona and Andrzej, if they're watching. Okay, you know what this is about. So the talk is called To Have Done with Judgment, Academic Writing / Anarchist Affects. And a word of caution, this talk might be or is a hopscotch. So be it. Please enjoy nonetheless and connect the dots, which basically means there's different parts which maybe do not really go together, so it depends on you to draw the lines between those. In 2004, Bruno Latour published a now canonical essay on the state of criticism, in which he posed the rhetorical question of whether criticism has run out of steam. Latour paints a bleak picture of a practice of criticism couched in military terms, with war, generals, projectiles, smart bombs, young recruits, and young cadets. According to him, this situation forces participants to take sides between those who know and those who are fooled, between appearance and reality, between surface and depth, with the critic seeing him or herself occupying the default position on the right side of the trenches. If critique, as Latour suggests, is all about letting off steam, then this will come to a natural entropic end. Steam machines don't run forever, not without external energy. Or, to couch it in Jane Bennett's term, no efflux without influx, and more important, not without the end in between. The end of influx and efflux is immensely important. It marks the hover time of transformation, a quote by Jane Bennett. In the often either-or of critique, the end is conspicuously missing. In Walt Whitman's work, this end seems to be an end in itself, both literally and conceptually, in his many enumerations, and is the building block of Whitman's lists, the groundwork of his paratactic discourse in politics. Here, the I connects and is connected to everything in the universe, to the spread of one's own body, to the drift of conversation, and to the conduit of water and electricity, to other people, to the contents of a book, to dung beetles, and to stars and nebulae. The Whitmanian I contain multitudes might thus be more than just a metaphorical figure of speech, referring to discursive contradictions. See, for example, Ed Young's book of the same name, I Contain Multitudes, this time referring to the life of microbes, which inhabit our body. The end is also the building block of what Gilles Deleuze has called an assemblage, a rhizomatic and fragmentary multiplicity that never adds up to one. It is by no means clear how the term agencement, the French word, can be translated most accurately into English. Deleuze and Guattari coined this term in the late 1970s as an alternative to their often misunderstood concept of the machine. While linguistically oriented translations rendered it as a concatenation of enunciations, it gradually became clear that it was actually about the complex linkages between sign and matter, technology and body, human and animal, etc. In his dialogues with Claire Panet, Deleuze gives us a shorthand of this idea. Substitute the and for is, a short motto which you could print on a t-shirt. I have to do that. In French, et, third person singular of être, to be, and et, in English and, are homophones. But this pun encapsulates what is at stake here, to undermine or even substitute a transcendental logic of being with a processual logic of becoming, and. Relations have to be produced, forged. Identity of the subject or a collectivity is thus always only a fragmentary effect of the perpetual flux of the given. For Deleuze, the assemblage, as a result of the and, is the basic unit of the social, the minimum real. Collective assemblages of enunciation are connected to a machinic assemblage of bodies, of actions and passions, an intermingling of bodies reacting to one another. It is the complex interplay of these segments, the dynamic conjunction of discourse and physics, that makes up the social field, that in fact produces semi-stable subjects in the first place. Politics is active experimentation, since we do not know in advance which way a line is going to turn. Quotation by Deleuze. A body politic as a teaming of nations, as Whitman had put it, cannot be but practical and paratactical, a fluctuating, semi-stable composition consisting of the motions of singularities, human and non-human. Whitman draws on a concept which he calls the aggregate, which I argue is very close to Deleuze's notion of the assemblage. The democratic aggregate should not integrate and fix its elements into a rigid system, but proceed by swerves, by ever-new inventions of external relations and intensities. Whitman refers to such intensive and effective relations as adhesiveness or sympathy. Indeed, fraternity, sympathy, comradeship, this for Whitman is the open paratactic line that composes the democratic aggregate, the vertical line that counters the hierarchical, segmenting horizontal of molar state apparatuses, of well-ordered governments. Adhesiveness is Whitman's terms for the body politic's perpetual invention of external relations, relations that are unprecedented, always new. As a force, then, adhesiveness is operative in the aggregate, in the process of aggregation, coming into existence in between. Whitman refers to this as unionism, which as a democratic process, unionism, is a minor force in opposition to the attempt at closure, of unity, a poetic political praxis as experiment rather than a fixed form. Desire creates by creating assemblages. Desire is there in Whitman everywhere. Again, not only in terms of joy and love, lust, adhesiveness, sympathy, camaraderie, but also ingrained in the very end. I said not only in terms of joy and love, I will come back to this later. Now, how does all of this add or link to the notion of critique and its alternatives? After the publication of Latour's essay, and as a response to it, the concept of post-critique gained wider currency. Rita Felsky, one of post-critique's main proponents, has offered a detailed classification of critique's characteristics. Critique is 1, secondary, 2, negative, 3, intellectual, 4, comes from below, 5, does not tolerate rivals. I am mostly interested in the second and the fifth qualities. The aggressive stance towards rivals indicates the judgmental either-or attitude I will talk about in a minute. On the other hand, the second quality sounds like a shorthand for the observation that critics are usually quick off the mark to interrogate, unmask, expose, subvert, unravel, demystify, destabilize. Put differently, critical discourse, must never formulate positive statements. It is always negative in relation to its object. This negativity produces what Rita Kuhl calls a normative glow, some kind of professional halo that prevents critics from engaging in a world where we have to communicate with people who do not already share our approaches and assumptions. In particular, in times like these, when the humanities are in need of defense or self-defense, it seems, academia needs non-academia in order to survive. Hence, the reflex attitude of knowing best poses a threat rather than a promise. Latour bemoans critique's Protean spite, as if critique should be reserved for the elite and remain difficult and strenuous, like mountain climbing or yachting. This elitist reflex that Latour is alluding to, I would say, is the reflex of judgment. What is at stake here is both a specific approach and a particular style of academic writing as such, not one of critique and resentment, but a style that is a style of life too, not anything at all personal, but inventing a possibility of life, a way of existing. The issue here is related to the question of judgment and ethics. And I quote Deleuze again, the painter Gustave Courbet spoke of people who woke up at night crying, I want to judge, I have to judge. The will to destroy, the will to infiltrate every corner, the will to forever have the last word. In this description, one can easily see the ugly face of critique, the critic priest, the critic judge, the moralist. The judge always insists on the this is how it is, this is how it works, on the either or, never giving in for a pause to disrupt this reflex, never giving the and a chance. Obsessive judging is a sad passion that piggybacks on a morality which suppresses vitality. It is full of resentment, subjecting everything to the permanent Weisenheimer attitude of subjugating, inhibiting, cutting down to size, critique, aggressively enforcing ideas of what's right, the right conduct and thought. Therefore, pour en finir avec le jugement is an ethical stance in Deleuze's work, and I'm proud of my French here. Judgment prevents the emergence of any new mode of existence. If it is so disgusting to judge, it is not because everything is of equal value, but on the contrary, because what has value can be made or distinguished only by defying judgment. One important strategy to avoid and counter judgment is to focus on affect's lines of flight. Deleuze, it is not a question of judging other existing beings, but of sensing whether they bring forces to us or whether they return us to the miseries of war, to the poverty of the dream, to the rigors of organization, that is, to sad passions. Putting the judgment reflex on pause allows for these lines of flight coming into being. Morality, by default, runs on a transcendent logic and an external framework that is posited as both a source of all explanation and as a higher reality. Runs on universal values, according to which one has to judge and be judged. In contrast, an ethics is what we might call an anti-juridical ontology. As Jill Bennett, another Bennett here, so not Jane but Jill, as Jill Bennett states, ethics is enabled and invigorated by the capacity for transformation. Because in contrast to external modalities of judgment and morality, it considers the forces and affects it encounters to be immanent forces, not external ones. An ethics, for Deleuze, always doubles up with a certain style and with an aesthetics. Quote, there are things one can only do or say through mean-spiritedness, a life based on hatred or bitterness towards life. Sometimes it takes just one gesture or word. It's the styles of life involved in everything that make us this or that. Therefore, reading and writing are ethical practices, and critique misses the mark. Since critique has long posed as the default mode of academic writing, students can spit out a critique with the push of a button. Are there alternative options beyond critique's destructive practice? As Helen Small has put it, the work of the humanities is frequently appreciative or imaginative or provocative or speculative more than it is critical. According to Brian Massumi, the question is not if critique is right or wrong, a rather moralistic question, but much more humble, pragmatic, and finally ethical. And I quote, "It is simply that when you are busy critiquing, you are less busy augmenting. You are that much less fostering. So why not start from the premise that activities such as thinking and writing are inventive and not about this world, but part of this world? Wait a minute. This then would mean that critique is an approach marked by a disavowing of this, its very own inventiveness, because it sees itself as uncovering something it claims was hidden, or as debunking something it desires to subtract from the world. It clings to a basically descriptive and justificatory modus operandi. What we need is a change of methods or techniques, that is, a turn to academic writing from a tool inspiring sad passions to a tool using affirmative effects, enjoyment, techniques which embrace their own inventiveness and are not afraid to own up to the fact that they add, if so meagerly, to reality. Such a, what Massumi calls productivist approach, makes sure that by adding exactly that ounce of positive experience to the world, you are affirming it, celebrating its potential, tending its growth, in however small a way, however really abstractly. If critique is running on empty, this might reveal that critique not only depresses, the aimed target of criticism, for example, critique in itself is depressive. And here I'm willingly misreading the etymology of depression, related to the Latin deprimer, to push down. Critique is deflated. Its own negativity has self-reflexed. The antidote and counterweight to that downward movement is elevation, for example, to bring into existence and not to judge. The affects sorely missed these days are affirmation and elevation. Joy and hope are affects worth provoking in order to inspire a belief in this world, as Deleuze has it. A depressed and depressing critique has drifted away from the world and is void of affirmative affects. Felsky asks, why is the effective range of criticism so limited? Why are we so hyper-articulate about our enemies and adversaries and so excruciatingly tongue-tied about our loves? Deleuze's response to this might be the following. If you don't admire something, if you don't love it, you have no reason to write a word about it. Or even more to the point, we would wish to only cite with love. As used here, love is one of the names for an affect that boosts the powers to act and liberates life. In a way, I argue this opens up a completely different idea of academic work. To not quote someone's work because you have to grudgingly admit that somebody knew better or knew first, but to open up a field in which inspiration and gratitude, which could even call it love, is more important than the mercantilist balancing of debts. Such a different academic ethics would be marked by joy, humor, generosity, and rigor, rather than a know-it-all fusspottery and academic cockiness. What's important is not so much what a book means, but what it does, which powers to act it prompts, and which affects it releases. This love also opposes what Deleuze, with Proust, sees as the dominating effect of the truth seeker, critic or even philosopher, who is but the jealous man who catches a lying sign on the beloved's face, and then judges in a tribunal of right or wrong. Deleuze and Guattari champion writers who write in a foreign language, or even more, writers who turn their own language into a kind of foreign language within language. Therefore, instead of opting for a critique of critique, which continues to take its warrant from critique, an alternative here might want to invite a foreign language of its own. What needs to be done, for Latour, for example, is to associate the word criticism with a whole set of new positive metaphors, gestures, attitudes, knee-jerk reactions, habits of thought. In short, a new effective ethos. A piece of advice that Deleuze gives may sound like libel and slander to academic writers. When it comes to ideas and concepts, and I quote Deleuze, all you should ever do is explore it, play around with the terms, add something, relate it to something else, never discuss it. However, it is exactly this playing around that gives rise to the inventiveness and effectivity of the writing process. Creative production rather than reception, representation, reproduction, anything reactive might also in the long run turn out reactionary. Both Masumi's productivist approach and Latour's compositional approach are directed at turning the text into a comrade, a co-actor that helps making things happen. Coming full circle to Whitman, in his attacks on any rigid drawing of lines, he had always favored disorderliness. And I quote Walt Whitman, a cosmos, disorderly, flashy, sensual. The fact that Whitman later changed the disorderly into turbulent betrays Whitman's interest in atomistic philosophy, in particular in Epicurus and Lucretius, whose De Rerum Natura he had been reading in the early 1850s. The replacement of Lucretian turbulence for the word disorder stresses the active force inherent in this concept. As Whitman had noted early on, to attack the turbulence and destructiveness of the democratic spirit is an old story. Why? All that is good and grand in any political organization in the world is the result of this turbulence and destructiveness. The active turbulence of the democratic experiment cannot be contained by well-ordered governments, nor by a polished fossil language. Only what Whitman calls the broad fluid language of democracy can capture this force, which in itself is turbulent, processual, and. Thus, Whitman demands, give us turbulence, give us excitement, give us the rage and disputes of hell. All this rather than the lethargy of death that spreads like a vapor of decaying corpses over our land. Whitman refers to the Lucretian clinamen, which creates turbulences in a striated order, forms vortices and eddies that connect atoms into temporary alliances. In a way, the clinamen is a not too distant reality of what we might call the pause, the break. The clinamen too disrupts cause and effect, introduces a hesitation that is boiling and bubbling with formative processes. John Cage once commented on the ethical responsibility of experimenting, and I quote, "I can't understand why people are frightened of new ideas. I'm frightened of the old ones." And Cage's patron saint, Henry David Thoreau, in Walden, states that that the written word is something at once more intimate with us and more universal than any other work of art. It is the work of art nearest to life itself. This is not so because of some autobiographical claim to truth, but because one is always writing to bring something to life, to free life from where it's trapped, to trace lines of flight. It is an affect in writing that appeals to that part of our being which is not dependent on wisdom, to that in us which is a gift and not an acquisition, and therefore more permanently enduring. This is a quotation from Joseph Conrad. And I think that thing in us which is a gift and not an acquisition will hopefully turn up later. Of course, there is no manual for how to do this, only a few tricks. Academic writers, in a way, may have to become artist philosophers, combining concepts, percepts, and affects, experimenting with multiple and mobile modalities of effective expression, moving away from posited meanings to effective operations in order to test how one performatively contributes to the stretch of expressions in the world, which is an ultimately ethical act, since it is to ally oneself with change, an ethics of emergence. Related to the domain of university education, it might be worthwhile to take the meaning of educare literally, to lead out, not to pick us up where we are, this where being the what we already know, but to experiment, to lead us out to a place where we have not yet been, providing an encounter with an outside of thought that forces us to think. And again, what's also immensely important is to get rid of those sad affects of domination and critique. So let's talk a bit about joy for a moment, about joyful affects that seem to be so conspicuously missing in academic writing and academic discourse. Let's go a bit Spinozian here. According to Spinoza, there are sad and joyful passions, sad and joyful affects. Sadness, frustration, aggression are those affects and passions that diminish and minimize my powers to act. Joy, on the other hand, joyful passions and affects maximize my powers. Power is a complex notion in Spinoza. In his Ethics, Spinoza differentiates between two conceptions of power, a differentiation that is largely lost in the English translation. There is potestas, which he uses to denote the sovereign powers of command and authority, and then there is potentia, Spinoza's term for force, strength, and creative activity. Even if this is decomplexifying a rather complex notion, it is potentia, which is the most important power in Spinoza's book, the one that is maximized by joyful passions and affects, whereas command and authority are rather reactive and sad powers. Command and authority, or potestas, in the contractual tradition of Hobbes, Rousseau, and Hegel, imply that forces are always individual in origin, and that they are needed because there will always be a crisis, a war, or antagonism that such a sovereign power proposes to solve, though it is an antagonist solution. Spinoza's anti-legalism, his fundamental idea that there is a spontaneous development of forces, at least virtually, opposes all of those aspects. By equating the sovereign state with the contract and with mediation and representation, Hobbes presents the transition from the state of nature to the civil state as paralleled by the transition from mere appetites to reason, so that reason as owned becomes the ultimate power in antagonistic solutions. Again, critique. The political impact of this distinction emerges in Spinoza's unfinished political treatise, where, as Antonio Negri claims, in Spinoza's political physics, the multitude becomes a productive essence. The potestas of the sovereign is actually the potentia of the people. Thus, the potestas of the sovereign, as Deleuze claims, is not a third party who gains by the contract made by the individual, a power that is then solidified by the law, but the potentia of the multitude, a dynamics of growing, becoming, and self-organization. The problem with Spinoza and Deleuze's reading of it is that Spinoza never explicitly makes clear how these joyful affects, indeed joyful passions, turn into actions. According to Spinoza, we act when something happens, in us or outside us, of which we are the adequate cause. That is, when something in us or outside us follows from our nature, which can be clearly and distinctly understood through it alone. On the other hand, I say that we are acted on when something happens in us or something follows from our nature of which we are only a partial cause. According to this, since we can never fully get rid of the influence of external bodies and inadequate ideas, we seem to be forever damned to remain in the realm of inadequacy, with no hope whatsoever to get into our power of acting. As Deleuze observes, the affections that naturally exercise our capacity to be affected are passions that reduce it to a minimum and cut us off from our essence and our power of action. Houston, we have a problem. However, shortly after the above-quoted observation, Deleuze nonetheless sees in this pessimistic assessment of existence a first glimmer of hope. The radical distinction of action and passion should not lead us to overlook a prior distinction between two kinds of passions, between joyful and sad passions. If all affects that arise from actions are necessarily joyful, the same cannot be said of affects that arise from passions. When we suffer passions, we can do so in either a joyful or sad manner. This possibility is due to the fact that our body can mix with bodies that either agree or disagree with our nature, and these to greater or lesser extents. When we mix with bodies that agree with our nature, our degree of perfection increases and we undergo joy. When we mix with bodies that disagree with our nature, our degree of perfection decreases and we undergo sadness. While we pass from a lesser to a greater degree of perfection when undergoing a joyful passion, however, we nonetheless remain passive. In other words, by suffering joyful passions, we more closely approach our formal power of acting, while nonetheless remaining within the realm of inadequate ideas. Even if joyful passions entail a passage from a lesser to a greater degree, we still cannot explain action in terms of the mere cumulative suffering of joyful passions. Still, sad passions, insofar as they constitute an encounter with something that weakens our power, and thus with what is bad for us, prove far less conducive to the eventual forming of coming notions than joyful passions do. Joyful passions promote in us a desire arising from joy. Our feeling of joy expresses an increase in our power, an expanse of our power that propels us into the world. It is this increase, this expansion, that propulsion that drives us towards further encounters with things that hopefully continue to agree with our nature, in both the part and the whole, and that therefore gives birth to a specific common notion or adequate idea. We must then form common notions by the very aid of joyful passions. In this picture, joyful passions prove absolutely central to the formation of adequate ideas, and thus to the power of reason. The affirmation of joyful passions allows us to come into a power of acting. And my shortcut here, which is something I will hopefully analyze more closely in the next paper, cringe, is that Kropotkin's concept of mutual aid is such an immensely powerful harbinger of joyful effects. A joyful action and a joyful passion at the same time, because you help and are being helped. So basically it's passion and action in one, so to speak. Which makes me see joy as the anarchist affect per se. Just check how often the word joy or enjoyment appears in Kropotkin's book. Against the Hobbesian contract theory of serenity, it locates force not in the single compartmentalized individual or potestas, but in the communism of the individual, in solidarity and mutuality, potentia. Water. Something a bit personal. I received lots of joy from 2 albums which I have been listening to lately on constant repetition, and from the titles of which I have distilled 2 concepts that I think are quite important in my view of things that I've delineated here. The first is the title of the last album of post-punk band Idols. While they claim in there, and that's the title of their album, joy as an act of resistance, I would slightly change that into joy is an act of resistance. Resistance against the drag and sad affects of reactionary control, judgment, and critique, desperately trying to solidify things as they are. In the case of university and education, resistance against those regimes of excellence, economic dependence, administration and bureaucracy overload, neoliberal market and entrepreneurship, etc. Regimes of which the reflexive judgment and critique are but symptoms, but regimes that, let's face it, are no longer external factors to academia, but part and parcel of it. Deleuze, trying to tackle the question, what is a creative act, comes to the conclusion that there is a close affinity between art and resistance. So art and creativity join forces with joy. Joy in Spinoza's and Kropotkin's sense, joy as an anarchist affect. The other concept I want to share is something that gives name to a slight variation I want to introduce to Kropotkin's idea of mutual aid. Against social Darwinism that emphasized competition and survival of the fittest, and against the romantic depictions that claimed that cooperation was motivated by universal or Christian love, Kropotkin argues that mutual aid has rather pragmatic advantages for the survival of human and animal communities. A key text in anarchist communism, Kropotkin's book shows not only the importance of mutual aid for prosperity and survival in both animal and human communities, he also spanks the state and capitalism for destroying historically important mutual aid institutions, particularly through the imposition of private property. Situated in his time, Kropotkin's idea still is based on a fundamental separation between human and non-human agents, I would argue, even though he also focuses on mutual aid in the animal kingdom. What I would suggest is a marriage between Kropotkin and Latour or Deleuze, if that was possible, to open up the concept of mutual aid also to non-human actors, not only animals, but also things. Remember that the word thing in the Old Nordic language, ting, refers to an assembly. A thing, or ting, was a folk mood, a governing assembly in early Nordic and Germanic societies, made up of the free people of the community presided over by a law speaker. This joyful play on the word thing or ting opens up something similar to what Latour has called the parliament of things. Thus, such a parliament does not only include humans and animals, but also things, objects. Latour's eloquent descriptions of the most ordinary objects, such as door keys and seat belts, are justly celebrated. Thus, why not rethink the concept of mutual aid with Latour's actor network theory in mind? If things too assemble us in all sorts of subtle and not so subtle ways, then mutual aid should take that into account as well. Let's take a short look at some other terms or concepts related to the idea of mutual aid. The origin of the word solidarity, for example, lies in the law of obligations. In the Roman Empire, anyone who lived beyond his means could, at least in theory, rely on the help of others. Roman law ensured the obligatio in solidum, according to which each family member had to pay for all debts, and conversely, the community had to pay for the debts of the individual. It was not until the end of the 18th century that this legal figure was applied to politics, society, and morality. Based on the question of debt, possessive relations, and the solid, this concept might also have to be rethought. The term comrade generally means mate, colleague, or ally, and derives from the Spanish and Portuguese term camarada, literally meaning bedmate or chambermate, from Latin camera, meaning chamber or room. In the late 19th century, Russian Marxists and other leftist revolutionaries adopted as a translation of the word kamerad the Russian word for tovarish, from Old Turk tavar, abbreviated tov, which almost reads like tovarish, whose original meaning was business companion or travel mate, deriving from the noun tovar for merchandise. This might be a good case in point for the inclusion of things and objects into the concept of mutual aid. As silly as it may sound, objects such as the bed, the chamber, goods to sell have been quite instrumental in shaping the concepts. And here I finally want to try to make a swerve again back to academia, back to the institution still known as university. This is also the time and place where I want to introduce that other concept which I retrieved from listening to joyful music. This time the band Horselords with their album Comradly Objects. This latest album is named after a concept prominent in Russian constructivism and their idea of objects being more than mere commodities. And I quote Alexander Rodchenko, a Russian constructivist, "Our things in our hands must be equals, comrades, and not these black and mournful slaves as they are here." The artists, so basically a kind of alternative to the capitalist commodity fetish. These constructivist artists attempted to forge a new comradely relationship between human subjects and the mass-produced objects of modernity. Constructivists could imagine no possessions, as John Lennon once put it, not by cancelling material objects per se, but by trying to eliminate the possessive relation to them, imagining a socialist culture that had not yet arrived by creating comradely objects. Thus, my idea to infuse the anarchist affect of joy and creativity into academe is to experiment with forms of education that are not only useful in terms of quantifiable knowledge production, I hate this word, forms that are unpractical but interesting, real experiments to which the result is not yet predetermined. Art, creativity, and joy are war machines. It is the praxis of mutual aid both on the obvious level of being and thinking together on eye level, but extended to comradely objects, which boils down to what I have somewhere else called a practical aesthetics. It's not a thinking about, according to a predetermined frame of external and transcendent strategies of analysis, but a thinking with, a solidarity, but not indebtedness, maybe fluidarity, with the objects, texts, artworks, to think and act with them as comrades, not forcing them into a possessive relation, such as critique or even explanation. As John Dewey had claimed, education is not preparation for life, but life itself. And every life is tasked with bringing other lives into being and sustaining. The continuity of the life process is therefore not individual but social. Thus, education in its broadest sense, according to Dewey, is the means of this social continuity of life. Education and mutual aid overlap here. And remember, life is maximized by joy. Any community, thus also the educational community, is held together through variation, not by sameness. It is a community, not just a living together, but literally a giving together, from come together plus munus, which means gift, in which everyone has something to give precisely because they have nothing in common, and in which solidarity and generous coexistence overcomes the essentialist regression to a primordial identity. Here it might be worth to draw the connection between Kropotkin's idea of mutual aid and Marcel Mauss's analysis of gift culture, a connection that has already been made by the likes of Marshall Sahlins and David Graeber. Having in common, like humanity itself, is not a baseline but an aspiration. That's a quote from Tim Ingold. Not given from the start, but a task that calls for a communal effort that demands of everyone, young and old, that they open up to others, each contributing in his or her own actions to the conditions of common life from which further variation might arise. And maybe this is what real freedom is, not a property, but a mode of existence. Exactly that mode of existence that acts and thinks with not only fellow humans and animals, but also comradely objects, fundamentally open to the world. And this world, it has to be stressed again and again, is not one. It might become one. This is a goal, not an a priori quality. Our universe is multiple, and it is one of becoming, a pluralistic universe that William James has once called the multiverse, which is marked by a continuous overflow of relations, and. And here we're back where we started. The multiverse, in short, is defined not by what its participants have in common, but by their communing, their giving, their mutual aid. And it is in the course of education, of leading life, that this commoning can be carried out. So let the coming university then be a place of joyful communing. Let it be a multiversity. Education is a substrate of living together, the workshop in which possible forms of life are tested. It is one of the most contested areas of our society. Formal and informal education, resources, tools and methods, whether face-to-face or on Zoom, childhood or lifelong learning. Education is the battleground on which society unequally distributes its future. Education needs to change, to move. But what good is knowledge if we don't know how to live? Why learn if we can't imagine the future? These questions are the mirror we don't want to look into. We are ashamed of not having answers, and it is easier to blame teachers and educators. So, how do we want to be educated? This is the question that a society that wants to be able to look at itself has to ask. It concerns all of us. We are all learners in the workshops where possible paths in life are tested. Education, thus, is not about implementing a curriculum. Education is the art of welcoming existence, developing awareness, and contesting the future. Education inside and outside of schools and universities is an invitation. The invitation to take the risk of learning together against the forces of our time that wants to keep us down. Yeah. That's it. So lots of different things, but I hope that at least there is a kind of, I don't know, you have to tell me.
Well, just wow, that was fascinating, and I really love your talk, and I would just suggest a different title. From Prague with Love, Bernd Herzogenrath.
Okay,
It would be even more fitting. But
we can do that.
Seriously, it was really a great talk, and you fulfilled all the promises I made for you at the beginning. You combined Deleuze, Spinoza, and anarchistic theory in a magnificent way. So hence my follow-up question, if I may start.
Do that.
It seems to me that precisely this reference to Kropotkin's mutual aid allows for even more radical view of academic life in general. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that the very phenomenon of mutual aid, which involves cooperation, solidarity, makes possible immediate experience of surplus, inclusiveness, as opposed to qualities that derive from competition as scarcity, precariousness, and exclusiveness. So I would say that the mutual aid itself is the basis for the experience of surplus. When I have a stimulating discussion, I feel as as being part of this mutual surplus of ideas, so to say. And it also immediately involves the inclusiveness which opens space for non-academicians, workers, artists, activists, whoever is interested. And as opposed to this view of academic life, there is the one based on competition, which precisely makes academia only for elites and for the privileged and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that it's possible to put it even more radically than just speaking of gift culture, because it's a bit. Let's say gift is something that is also expected. It in Moss theory, it's a cement of society. It sticks, brings us together. So I wonder whether you would agree with this more radical view, or will you
the thing is,
elaborate?
Yeah, the thing is, I'm not really sure if this is more radical. The question for me would rather be if. I mean, okay, so we could connect that to, for example, the Deleuzean idea, if we misread that university needs a non-university in order to survive. So that basically opens up all these kind of possible connections again. But for me, the more radical step would be, because that would still remain within the, let's say, the human community, the human realm. Of course, like not university community, but other communities, but still human community. But for me, the idea would be to expand this idea to what I said, also to non-human agents, because I think this is really what you can't do without that anymore. Because in today's society, all theoretical endeavors and political perspectives go towards this more inclusive idea of maybe even community. So I think sticking with the concept of mutual aid purely within the human realm is like reducing the possibilities, which why I wanted to expand that to. I mean, the first step would, of course, for the animal rights people to include animals, but I think that's still not radical enough. You would also need to include the kind of material realm at large, and that from the perspective of thinking, first of all, within the university would also require a different way of dealing with or encountering with the things that we do. Not as a kind of thing that we are in the position, we simply make sense of that and explain it, but in a kind of also mutual aid position that even the text can help us. So it's not the text that we have to explain, but maybe we can learn something from that by treating it as a comrade. And I think that for me is a thing which goes beyond that. Mutual aid is just something between people. It goes beyond that. So I don't know if that makes sense in your direction, because I think that goes into a different direction. But I think for me, we would have to start much more in a much more fundamental a problem or question about that mutual aid thing.
I totally agree. I also think that the academia should be environmental inherently, which precisely opens possible connections with non-human sphere immediately, and basically it's not possible even to do it otherwise today, at least give it a try.
And of course the thing is that I still argue from within the institution of education university, what you are basically trying is to open up that space to other inclusions, and that's something also I think this is a question at the moment also. There are quite a people who basically claim that the institution of the university is something we should totally get rid of because it's old-fashioned, it's feudal, or if not feudal then capitalist, all these kind of things. But I think there might also be a way to do that from within the university, and that play on words that Tim Ingold basically brought into play, to use the term multiversity and following other perspectives that the neoliberal university basically has closed itself off of, is something that could be used to not get rid of that thing totally, but basically to change it in such a way that it makes sense to a changing world, or in a changing world. Mm.
Maybe I should rephrase to make my point clear. It just seems to me that all the gift culture and gift theory comes as a secondary with regard to what you were describing. At least it seems to me that this experience of surplus, inclusiveness could be way more fundamental than gift culture, which for me makes it more difficult to connect with nature, for instance. Or I wonder, how would you put it in terms of environmental?
Yeah, but I think this is what indigenous people's relation to nature, for example, is based on. So it is gift culture. It's basically that if you kill a tree or whatever, you know that you have also killed a spirit. So you have to in a way include or indulge in that kind of circulation of gifts in order to pay for that. And this is something which is not paying in terms of commodity exchange or something. It's something that stays in a circle. And I think even so, this is really like how do you call it? Sophistry by focusing on wordhoods and things. But the word community or communitas also has these basically two strands there, because the munus in community, which I also refer to here, can mean both debt and gift. So the word has these two meanings. So that to me suggests that there might be two possible ways of community. One that is based on the notion of the debt, which is more like commodity exchange, like I give you something, you have to pay me back, in that terms of thing, and based on the notion of gift. And that would be something, and I do not yet know what that looks like, but I think that might have a possibility to go into that direction. And in terms of academia, this is basically for me the clearest sign of that is what I mentioned by this idea of quoting, because it is like that. Let's be honest, right? We always quote because we grudgingly admit, okay, so somebody thought that, so I hide it in a footnote, right? Because I don't want people to see that somebody else was already there. So it's more like, okay, I have to, because otherwise I haven't paid my debt. You know? The other thing would really be to not do it like this, like I have to, but basically I want to, because this opens up a circulation or builds a network which is based not on whatever, like paying debts, but on inspiration, gratitude, things like that. It all sounds so utopian, but I think that if one could work on that, that would result in a total different almost ethical economy in academia. I don't know. So that's maybe my personal Bernd's utopia of doing things. But
thank you very much for explaining this, because it allows me to formulate my point better. And it seems to me that precisely there is a debt involved in every gift. It's expectation. Even Aboriginal who kills animal is obliged to pay homage to its spirit, and there is always some feeling of lack, sacrifice, debt in every gift. When I give you a gift,
I want something.
You are
right.
expected to give it back,
yes.
whatever, and this establishes the mutuality.
Right.
Whereas, and this was my actual question. Whereas it seems to me that there could be something like immediate experience of abundance, of surplus, that is way more fundamental than the gift that you put in opposition to adapt. Sorry.
But I still think, sorry,
no.
sorry. But I still think the main difference is that even if there's an expectation, there is an endless process going on. Because the other thing is you get something and saying, yeah, great, and I put it in my shelf or I sell it, or so where I stop that kind of endless circulation. And this is something which a gift culture, even in the Aboriginal sense, would not agree with. So it always has to, and that's the kind of endless things that ensures a kind of mutuality which involves people's tribes and whatever, and not just like if I sell you something. And you put it in your shelf, and then it's over. Yeah, so that's a much far-reaching circulation or networking, whatever you would call it, that is opened up by this kind of. Even if, as you said, of course, there's also the third alternative of that direct experience of overflow or whatever. Yeah, but I think but that would also maybe shut it down. So I'm not sure about that. Because if you enjoy it completely, then there's nothing more to give or to give further, or however you would call it.
Okay, now I see your point.
I don't know.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So,
sorry.
No, you don't need to apologize. That's fine.
I do.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was such a rich talk that unfortunately I cannot remember
me neither.
points and details, so let me be kind of vague, but I have an affirmative and a negative point. So
negative first.
So I'm totally with you, I would say, with this plea for a different kind of approach. Let's call it affirmative, an affirmative critique. The and, the connection, the assemblage, and that something has to change in academia completely and absolutely and 100%. And I think, and that's the question, if you would follow that line, that in consequence, what you are trying to develop is something that has to do with also a radical change in methods. That this critique, judgment that you kind of put away is connected to a specific writing, to a specific commentary technique, to specific observation techniques, etc., etc. Let's call it specific media of research. And that now we are moving, at least in certain areas, towards a different kind of research, which is also connected with the intersection of theory and practice, artistic practice. So it doesn't have to be just artistic research, but all the approaches that you also developed in the book, of course, that deal with a performative gesture or the performative dimension of doing research, of doing theory. That it's not something, I am writing in a neutral way, me as a neutral being, in a neutral way about something, some object that's far away and I'm not involved. It's all this thing about situated knowledge, about embeddedness, about etc., etc. So it might go, if we go your direction, might be my question, that we go also in the direction of a different theoretical practice, maybe even artistic practice or something different, something in between artistic practice. And you were also quoting, of course, authors from literature, who we can say do theory in a way of philosophy, or they definitely do thinking, a different kind of thinking. Right. So that would, if I understand correctly, that might be the consequence of this kind of and I mean I see it this and practice, and I don't know if you know that Peter Baxter wrote a nice article or 2-3 articles about the end. And he has a lot of examples from artistic practice. You know, where you have this Dadaism, you put things that don't belong together, you put together and you create something different. So it's eminently an artistic practice, this
Yes.
practice, right?
Right.
It's not so much in the practice in writing, and definitely not academic writing. That would be very bad academic writing in a way if you just and.
Sure.
We like our students, we would like it. I think mostly if they will just add things associated.
Yeah.
Right? But it's a very common practice and a very critical practice in art.
Right.
Right.
So yeah. So the thing is that and of course you're right. It would look awkward, but of course it looks awkward because we have that gold standard of academic writing, what it has to look like, right? Which basically turns all the text you write into basically almost like clones of each other, right? Because you have first the state of the art, and then introduction, and theoretical. So everything looks the same. It's the same kind of machine that works only with different ingredients. But yeah, and that would at least open up a possibility for other experimental things. Which of course that I'm not insinuating that we all have to become poets when we write academic papers, but at least to infuse some of these more experimental and not predetermined ways of doing things. And that might also, I guess, I mean, that's what you mentioned also does not only point to the direction of artistic research, or whatever, but one might even say that this is exactly the differentiation between theory and philosophy. Right? That theory is more that kind of methodology that already has a predetermined framework with which you come from the outside, and philosophy is more, at least nowadays, more inclined with trying to think with the object of your scrutiny, and not develop a pre-existing framework with which you catch the fish, so to speak. Yeah? And that for me would be really a marker which differentiates theory from philosophy, maybe.
Yeah, so no, definitely. I think that's an interesting direction, and let us see how we can write text in that way. And now that we have the negative criticism, thing, because I think that's always also good, and that's already there. That I think this affirmative line is one dimension of what you are presenting, but there's also a negative critical line. And that's that you exactly draw a distinction between, I've written out just some things, what you criticize. Judgment, it's disorder, it's turbulence, there's a lot of things where you kind of, in order to make your point, you need to make the distinction between what we don't do and what we do. And there comes in, for me, a negativity of a different kind than what you kind of disregarded. And that's, of course, me as a student of Dieter, what can I say? You always have to point to negativity as the limits of something.
Right.
Limits of language, limits of your knowledge, the rupture, the space, the break. You also mentioned cage and hesitation, a pause. That is a negative moment, right? It's
yes.
Strong,
right.
Or
disturbance.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You know? So those are the moments where you can jump in. There you can criticize the thing and I believe still that those are a very important part of all the approaches that you also mentioned, also of A&T and the whole human thing, etc. Because that is a critique of a specific perspective on things, on animals, of this distinction between human and animal, of objectification. So that's always in the background. It's not just about, okay, we leave this background behind and we live with things, because then we would again end up in an anthropocentric view, I guess, of saying, oh, the thing wants that and the animal does this. And that's precisely what we don't want to do, right? It's precisely about this drawing, also, that's very important, drawing a line in between my perspective as a human and the thing, which I can't talk for, I can't talk about, but I can't also express what the thing means, or what it does, what it wants. There we would be in a bad metaphysical thing, right? And not speak about animals like all philosophers have done. I don't know, Heidegger, the animal is weltlos and the human is not. How do I know what the animal is?
Sure.
But there it's again about this very traditional Kantian Kantian critique, the critique of the limits of my knowledge, of what I can say, of what, etc., you know, of this situation.
Right, right.
So that's my question. If you exclude this kind of negative critique, or how can it be connected to
Yeah,
the end?
good question, and I don't have an answer. So, because the thing is that I don't know. I think there is something in the way that of course we use language that does not really allow us to take that other position that you mentioned. So my answer would not be an answer, but a question. How does Dieter do it? Because I know that he's very concerned with. I think he also wrote that on negativity and aesthetics and whatever. How the fuck does no? But seriously, it's a serious question because I have no idea how to do that, because it's almost like that kind of Russian doll within Russian dolls, because in a way you can you get there, and if yes, would that not be yet another position of the thing that you wanna counter?
No, it is. It's always, and we always ask him again and again. Yeah, but Dieter, when is
yes, please enlighten us.
About different knowledge, so but you cannot speak about different
right,
knowledge
because it's not
different.
right.
You're making
Yes,
it the same if you're speaking about thinking not in language, but you're saying that in language that
right.
is speaking not in language, and you always just it's this running. To say it in English is very hard because it's German thinking. It's like running against the borders of language. You know,
right.
It's the facing the rupture and facing muteness and but you still have the positivity of his text.
But I think this is really, so maybe that's the thing. So even if you know that you will never get there, that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. Because but seriously, because the alternative is basically just to stay with the status quo, right? So the only option maybe you have is to, like he said it, to try and run against the wall again and again, just in order to maybe from within change a little bit, even if you will never be able to make the step outside, and even if you were able to, it wouldn't help anyways, right? Because there would be that other wall, because you still have another dichotomy or whatever that you have to face. So maybe that's the only thing.
To me it's okay. I'm sorry, I don't want to take up so much space, but it's we've been discussing that, of course, at Zurich University of the Arts, where I work, dealing with practitioners, with people who think in a different way than in language, and they do not think also in academic writing.
Sure.
When they write in a different way, poetically, whatever.
Yes.
And Dieter was always the advocate of we're like we're facing each other. It's not like we are speaking. We philosophers, theorists are speaking about the artist, about what they think, maybe if they think. But we can have a dialogue, and so for me that's kind of the enactment of this problem of them working in this affirmative way, let's call it, and this that they just react to questions by doing something. So of course it's positive, it's affirmative. They will say, okay, the problem is why I do journalism. That's my question. That's my answer to the problem. So that cannot be negative because they work in practice, so it's always positive.
Okay.
Right? So Dieter's thing about an image can never be negative because it's an image, you see, it's positive. But then there's this other position where you try to change your thinking by writing against these borders or along the limits but the goal is not the text that you're producing, it's not a theory, it's not a concept, but a transformation of thinking that allows you to see different things, to allow a different thinking, that opens up concepts. But I guess it's a Wittgenstein answer that you throw away the ladder, climb by, and then you are in some void between theory and
totally enlightened, but nobody you can talk to.
But you're neither nor in that.
I have a follow-up comment, if I may, and then I pass word to Marcel. But
Yours first.
just, if I may speak for my dear friend Bernd, I have a suggestion, because you referred to Kant, and it seems to me that basically what Bernd is offering to us is something like an enhancement of Kant's third critique, namely Kritik der Urteilskraft, which in German sounds even more strange than in English. But it's judgment. It's about critique of judgment, and Deleuze, in his reading of Kant's critical philosophy, suggests that in first two critiques, Kant presents classical philosophy of harmony of all cognitive faculties, whereas the third critique is romantic, turning point. And it seems to me that what Bernd presents is a post-romantic approach to judgment that goes already beyond the experience of sublime and makes it possible to see the differences that are non-conceptual, or that allow us to go beyond the human cognitive faculties. And I wonder if you would agree with this perspective. But well, this was just kind of brainstorming.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, I don't know if you are asking first, maybe, but
go ahead.
Because my question is maybe that, well, I don't know how to say it. Yeah, not so maybe interesting. But for me, you are say something about demoralization and the problem of demoralization. Against maybe something like this transformation or some other stuff. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's like the question about maybe, for example, the really concrete example from the Slovak society. Mm-hmm. We have this terrorist attack against the gay bar, and there is two people who died, and there is, of course, this moral panic. Mm-hmm. And this moralization, of course, against the society. So in this case, I think this moralization is in some way good, for something like resistance against the society, for example, mm-hmm. or something like that. So that there is no possibility for the people to something like I think the ethical transformation against these people who is against them. So they must be in this moral distance and bringing something from the universal, as you said, that there is not good in this case, but in this case, maybe no, in this case, of course, but in this case, it's the different situation that there is this universal value, mm-hmm. which is the gay rights, and this is the something like the motor or of this moral maybe distance or something mm-hmm. like that in this. So. What I want to say, and maybe the second question is it's dependent. It's really close together. So if we are talking about this openness and joyfulness or some other stuff, so there is like sometimes it maybe can be the playing with the fire. Yeah, for example, if it is good, playing with the fire is like I hope that this is not the argument that Hitler, but if we read that Mein Kampf, we must have critical distance, mm-hmm. Not be the joyfulness and be open for this there or something like that. So there is this stuff that there is bad things from the point of view of this your point of your not your of anarchism and your theory or something like that. Because these things maybe is like playing with the fire, which can burn us, and of course there is some bad people. Yeah, in this case, of course it's which maybe can be something bad for us, and there is something like what is this connection here, because That's my question. Maybe I don't know if I formulated good. So sorry.
Yeah. So maybe it goes into the. I think there's two things that I would like to comment on. The one is the distinction between moral and ethics, and I really think that there is a. And maybe we're mixing up terms here also sometimes, because for me, moral is basically the kind of how would you call it? It's almost like a rule book. Yeah. So basically, it's nothing that comes from the situation, but culture has at some place decided this is good and this is bad. And this is a kind of, as you said, almost like universal thing, even if it's not universal, because every culture has its own criteria for doing this. Ethics would be more related to how that applies within the given situation. So not a transcendental framework, but something that is immanent to the exact situation that we're talking about. So I'm not really sure in that case where you would draw the. Would you say that this is a universal value that needs to be upheld, or is it?
Yeah, in this case, of
okay.
rights, of human rights,
yeah.
For example. Because it is that, in this point of view, for these people, it is universal. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So,
okay.
Of course, it is Kantian in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's maybe bringing Kant back to the game. I don't know how to say it, maybe. Or I don't know. So that's the problem for me. That of course that there is, and I think this is disconnection in some way. So I don't know how to deal with that, of course, because I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know either here, but the other thing is of course that I don't think that openness and all these kind of things I mentioned necessarily ensure that everything there is roses. That doesn't. It's not what is meant, right? So it's not that utopian idea just because. There are no hierarchies, whatever. Everything will be perfect. Of course, there's also right anarchists, and right. So that doesn't mean that the absence of certain hierarchical structure ensures that this is going to be great.
Yeah, of course, but
so not per se.
That's for me the question: where is this good using of hierarchy in
yeah.
this case? Because of course, the open and playful, for example, in this society is relatively safe. We can say, yeah, because. We are in the maybe same mood, or I don't know how to say, maybe in same intellectual tradition, not completely same, but let's say that the Western, for example, university tradition, or I don't know how to say it better. But also there is this guys, for example, in Slovakia, who
sure,
who is really dangerous,
right,
really dangerous. Yeah. So that's for me that this is not place sometimes to play with them in this case, to be joy or I don't know how to say it. Yeah. So that what I want to say is that, okay, but you say me, so that's all what I want to hear. So.
Yes, thank you for your excellent, fascinating talk. I hardly know, to cut it down from 15 questions to 2.5, or just to give you a hit parade of comments and see if there's something interesting there. But I maybe in the first case, a more simple question is, what would the relation of your talk be to the status of the Deleuze text, to have done with judgment in that collection of essays?
Yes. Yeah.
And then the second question would be the status of experiment in relation to experience and energy, because this notion that experimentation is what really stirs one up and is a very, Deleuzean operation, of course, which is crucially interested in bringing in the new. To me, that's the main issue of Deleuze.
Right.
Is how do you create the new?
Right.
But what is the status of the experimental operation in league and tandem with the experience of it, and is this tapping into certain forms of energy? Because it seems like in a certain way you're talking about investing in critical delight and joy, which one wants to affirm with Spinoza and Deleuze and that whole modeling of things. But on the other hand, of course, we have the Frankfurt School tradition and Walter Benjamin, and they instantiate maybe a kind of dark energy, kind of counter-textuality or counter something more negative. And So it's kind of hard to negotiate the two ideological multiverses on some way, isn't it? Because how do you reconcile? Maybe you don't reconcile.
No.
That's the issue. There's no reconciliation, say, between Zizek and Spinoza. I mean, Zizek and Deleuze on some level, even though you can try, and maybe you should, but I'm just, some of these ideas, I'm wondering how they map on, or maybe they have to stay in a certain way factional. You stay in that Deleuzean amazing constellation with Spinoza, and that's enough. But then on the other hand, you wonder, undergirding this on some level, if you talk about joy as an anarchist affect, and the very category of the anarchistical, for some, would be concomitant with a certain spirit of the capitalistical, of course. Jameson argues the anarchists have won, basically. And Zizek would argue something the same. That this is part and parcel of our, capitalist life world. But be that as it may, so there are some maybe micro-level contradictions, even as one endorses what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Precisely the status of experience and energy, first question, I guess, and second question is the status of the great text. It might be the best thing. I tell my students this is the best thing Deleuze ever wrote, to have done with judgment. In terms of economy, in a few pages, he gives you so much. Even though it's, I taught it in my Kafka class recently, and you sometimes think all it really does is cultivate your intellect and mobilizes your faculties, and it's not really anything you can take away concretely, but I still think it helps the students do those imaginative push-ups. It might be otherwise. I mean, yes, when you teach Andrei Rublev by Tchaikovsky or something, it's a brilliant text to refer to. This whole problem of judgment, right? And why doesn't Rublev paint the Last Judgment? These kinds of aesthetic moments, it can be very used in a formalizing strategy. But on some level, it's hyper abstract.
Yeah, I don't know. For me, this text is basically, as you said, in a nutshell, it tells us about, that's how I read it, that there are certain forms of how to call that even, acting to and with each other, that from the word go, basically stop everything, every potential, stop it in its tracks, because basically the idea is this is how it is, full stop. And that's for me is the lesson that I take out of that, because it connects to all these ideas of the joyful affects which open up new possibilities in life. So that would also be my maybe a shorthand question. So I can't respond to all the things that you opened up.
But this moment, you asked me to do an hour, 2 hours.
Yes, right.
The ending is key too, right? It's love and hate in the final account.
Maybe, but it's also about pushing energy down and letting it flow, because for me that would be the thing. Yeah. So energy. So I don't want to go into the Frankfurt School. I come from Frankfurt, and I don't have anything to do somehow with that Frankfurt. There's some things by Benjamin which I would rather read into what Deleuze is saying here. But the point is. Negative energies and all these kind of things you could also relate to not action but reaction. So it's always a blocking of possibilities, even if there is energy, but the blocking of certain things, of course, reduces that. And so the experience that comes out of that, which is related to maybe the openness, is of course also blocked if you already know what you want to experience, right? So if you already have that framework, and this is why, of course, you mentioned that this notion of experiment is so importantly connected to the idea of experience, because the experiment in the way that Deleuze understands is exactly that you can't predetermine it. Then it wouldn't be an experiment. Yeah.
And then I wonder about the notion of a fresh circulation. The circulation is kind of the buzzword of our contemporary situation.
Sure.
Because I teach a course on circulating the cinematic image at FAMA
for
a long time, and I was intrigued that you brought up the word circulation about 6 times,
but that was in connection with the gift culture thing. So it's
right.
So I don't know if you can draw a connection here between.
Yeah, Yeah, well, that also brings in the problem of judgment. When I think about ideas of responsibility or gift, debt, gratitude, obligation, if it always is impossible to judge in a way for Jula's, but how does that play out in terms of, I'm all for this Falstaffian, a manifesto of a culture of largesse and generosity.
Yeah.
We seem to be further away from now than at any point in the last, 2,000 years or whatever. But I'm wondering, how does the judgment operation play out with this culture of debt and gratitude and
yeah, but I think very how would you call that? Even in the way that you could imagine that is that judgment is a thing that ends circulation. Just as a very simple answer to that. So judgment would say here circulation ends, right? So here it is defined, and I'm saying how it is, and this is how it is, and full stop. And that would, of course, totally kill circulation and experimenting and whatever, kill it off in its tracks. So I think it all boils down to the same thing. Either you call it energy or circulation or whatever. This is what doesn't, or what blocks and doesn't enhance further circulation experience. Yeah. Yeah.
And then it makes me think about the problem of, it's such a big word, or lexical unit, trans. So transcreation, transindividuation. A lot of what you're saying seems to need a modeling of subjectivity that involves the notion of possibility of two or more parties being real subjectivity. Various things you said.
Yeah, maybe even to see the concept of subjectivity not as one. This is why the individual and whatever comes in. So it's. But it's also, I think it all goes into the same direction, so that judgment would also, even saying I am this would be a judgment from my perspective, and that would also totally block off, okay, and what else? So
engaging in the criminal activity of identity.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding our age of identity politics. So this is I could continue, but thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thanks.
So, any other questions, comments, protests?
Donations.
Donations, right?
Maybe one.
Now that I think of it.
No, that's only I hope I say it maybe clear, or I don't know, because it's only something which I try to think is that if you talk about the Cage, John Cage, I think, the Deleuze and other thinkers who talk about this old against new and some other stuff. So this is for me interesting because both of this thinker, Deleuze and Cage's, I think that the excellent in their in the part of the department, or I don't know how to say it, the sphere of society, for example, music and philosophy. So for me, this is the question that if it is not possible to only play in this way as they want, only in the basis of this excellency, which is based on the university, this knowledge and this other stuff, this rethinking and any other way, because if I'm play with piano, for example, it sounds like cacophony from my pieces or something like that. So I can try to play something, but or paint something, for example, and maybe I think that when I am not excellent in some way, I'm not so open for this playfulness here, because if I'm only some amateur in this case, it's easy for me to draw stereotype, maybe much more.
Yeah.
So, but if I'm excellent, I don't reply something in, I don't know, maybe it's not true because I'm not artist, so sorry for if it's a bad interpretation, but only if I'm the excellent in this way, I think I can draw something which I play with that, maybe much better way. I think maybe it's much easier for me to play with that. But the excellency is like this hard rethinking of all the stuff and try to do something, I don't know, draw some figure at the beginning and portrait and some other stuff, and then I can do this, for example, avant-garde or neo-conceptual thinking. I don't know, maybe this is bad interpretation, I don't know. This is maybe the question maybe about this university stuff, yeah, because we thought that, okay, this playfulness I understand, but this excellency, which is of course the purpose for many people of the university, of course, which I think you can be against maybe in some way, because it sounds really elitist maybe in some kind, yeah, or so maybe, yeah, this way, as I said, it's old thinking and some other stuff.
But maybe there's also a different juxtaposition or whatever that might come more handy here, because if you now go back to the realm of art that you mentioned, you said only once you've achieved excellency then you can like go beyond that and basically do all these kind of weird shit that, yeah. Maybe it's the other way around, because there was that American artist Cy Twombly who basically painted all the things that he did. They almost looked like kids' drawings, small children's drawings, right? But for somebody who was trained in the excellency, it was the hardest thing, because the hardest thing here was to unlearn all these kind of strategies, right? So it's not that you have to pass beyond in order to achieve this thing, but it's almost like not helpful. It's a kind of blockage to all the possibilities there. So I don't think that it works this way around. Yeah, it only works with that way if you cling to that notion of, and this is also what Cage went against. So it's not about the genius of or ingenuity of the composer or whatever. It's the exact opposite. To not have already preformed notions of this is good, this is excellent, this is better than this is a symphony, and all these kind of things. And only once you unlearn that, you can be open to seeing, for example, music, and then the term doesn't really fit anymore, as something that is even here when we make noises. Yeah,
of course.
So it's more a question of not reaching that level and going beyond, but of not even attempting to go there, maybe. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it works from a different perspective or different position than what you just painted here.
Yeah, I understand. Of course, that's a good answer from.
Yeah, please. I actually might have just a short sort of question following up all these, artistic examples. I mean, when you speak about academia, what exactly do you mean? I assume you're referring mainly to humanities, philosophy,
yeah, sure,
right?
yeah.
There's lots of other academias.
Of course.
And it's not only arts, but natural sciences, technical sciences as well. Where I think if one would be looking for a different sort of, in the humanities scholarship, what we do is talk to other people, whether living or dead, through context, right? But in the other academias, there are different forms of relationships, both human and non-human, and it's not only arts, but in the natural sciences, you have people working with anything from microbes, nanomaterials, to climate, or in agricultural sciences, etc., etc. One question would be, why is that very often missing from our discussions, and we rather tend to turn towards art? You mentioned Latour, you might be one of the exceptions.
Right.
And then, the other question is, could perhaps one look to, this form of research, and I'm talking about academic writing in natural sciences, and that's one of the fields where we in the humanities tend to have a very difficult relationship. With them, right? But more the level of, the research, this interaction, whether lab work or field work, if that can be relevant at all.
Yeah, I think two things. Of course, the first thing would be that's where I come from. So my knowledge of mathematics is even lower than my knowledge of Czech. Yeah? Just to give you an idea. But the other thing is, since you mentioned Latour, and I think there it becomes clear that what at least through Latour's reading of natural sciences, what we in the humanities could learn is exactly this thinking with or working with, because all his field work on the laboratory and the microbes is basically by how would you call that even, by encountering the microbe on its own level, not with a preconceived, and because of that we could develop our theory, how whatever the microbes work, how vaccination, all these kind of things work. And at least in that example, it was, as far as I understood, it was really by not having a preconceived notion, but basically by listening to the microbe, if you put it like that, in order to come up with that. And maybe this is something that, in our perspective, or the humanities perspectives to the natural sciences, I think it's a mutual hate, of course, right? But I think if there's something that we could learn, is exactly this. Maybe not the consequences, that there's only one way to do that, after that, things like that. But I think that listening to your object or whatever would be something that I would definitely take, at least from this way of reading natural sciences with laboratories and field work and all these kind of things. But as I said, so I'm not in that field, so I can't really say something about that. Right?
Sorry, I just have one other question, if I may. The status of critical thinking in all of this. I mean, because on some level, the idea of domination and critique is sad affects, but at the same time, many lament that we live in the age of the death of critical thinking and criticism in the corporate university and all the rest. So I'm just wondering, I mean, isn't there a way in which we can argue for different spirits? There's a critical thinking that could invest in joy and delight.
Yeah.
All for this love operation,
sure,
and all this.
Yeah.
And there's something else that, maybe there are different spirits even of this dark energy we might talk about. It doesn't have to all be downhill to darkness and not inspire the soul.
Yeah.
It can still be quite radically negative and yet radically emancipatory, Fassbinder film.
I think one of the main problems here, and I have to admit that, is that of course there's a difference between, let's say, critique in the American university context and critique in the European context. And maybe that's already the point where, because critique in the American university context is about that. So basically I read a text in order to find all the flaws. Yeah? To basically say you're wrong here, you're wrong there, you're wrong here, and not basically engaging in a kind of dialogue, which of course in the European context and also in the context of critical thinking works slightly differently. So it doesn't necessarily...
That's how I meant it too, right?
Yeah.
Someone who teaches in Europe, right?
Yeah.
Like exactly, just that, the most thought-provoking thing about a thought-provoking age.
Right, yeah.
Notorious Heidegger is that we're not yet thinking. And maybe because thinking begins with the unconscious, and we're not even tapping into the unconsciousness either.
Yeah.
But all you're talking about is also slightly about the unconscious too, I suppose, on some level, with all this Spinozaism, that could not have even happened without Spinoza.
Yeah. But I think there's this
directions we can go with this. But I was just wondering that in terms of the actual critical thinking, because I just had a student submit a PhD on Lacanian sexuation as an alternative to the genderqueer paradigm, and she had translated some Russian psychoanalytical thinking that people don't really know well outside of Russia. And at one point she argues that Smolyansky, this theorist, argues against critical thinking in a way. And sometimes I have reservations because I prefer the idea of the notional possibility of thinking.
Yeah, sure.
Even though I don't want to take over all my sad affects.
Yeah. No, but I think that's exactly the thing. So like engaging with them. So that could also be a definition of critical thinking. Yeah, not just like.
Yeah.
but that's, I think is exactly.
Circulating. Maybe.
Yeah. Right.
An intellectual circulates in a certain way in their materials for a creative person.
Yeah.
Okay, this is it.
This is it.
So thank you very much once again.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for coming.